Between roughly 1965 and the early 1980s, American family structure shifted in ways that produced an entire cohort of children who came home from school to an empty house and managed their own afternoons. And those children are now the parents of teenagers and the middle managers of most U.S. institutions. They are the so-called latchkey kids of Generation X, born 1965 to 1980, and the arrangement was not planned by anyone, was not approved by any expert committee, and emerged instead from the slow collision of rising dual-income households, single-parent households, increased divorce rates, and longer commute times in U.S. cities, a widely cited figure collected in 1984 by the U.S. Department of Education and reanalyzed by various researchers since put the count of children aged 5 to 13 who regularly spent time home alone at around 14.3 million. Roughly 25% of all K-12 students at the time across the United States on a typical school day afternoon. Other surveys produced lower estimates, with the U.S. Census Bureau and academic studies reporting between 7 million and 13 million children unsupervised after school in any given week in the same era. And a review of the literature published in the late 1980s and 1990 by Padilla and others found estimates ranging between 23% and 50%, depending on methodology and region. The American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry reports that over 40% of children are left alone at some point in any given month, though rarely overnight and rarely for very long periods, on the same calendar across the same country on the same surveys taken in the same broad era of U.S. family life in the 1980s and early 1990s. The numbers vary by source, but the order of magnitude is consistent across every dataset. Millions of children every weekday afternoon for years at a time, with no adult present in the home from roughly 3:15 p.m. until 6:30 p.m., or later on most days in most U.S. cities across the same working class and middle class neighborhoods. The rise coincided with the steepest increase in maternal labor force participation in U.S. history, with only about 19% of married women with children under 6 in the labor force in 1960, and that figure doubling to around 51% by 1985, according to Bureau of Labor Statistics records from the same era on the same calendar. The infrastructure for child care outside school hours never scaled to match the rise in maternal employment. Licensed after-school programs operated by IMCA, schools, and municipalities have always enrolled only a fraction of the school-age population whose parents were unavailable at 3 p.m. on a typical weekday afternoon in the same neighborhoods. The term latchkey kid comes from the house key worn around the neck or clipped to a belt loop, not a metaphor. A literal object a child wore on their body every weekday. Afternoon after school, and a common 1980s vignette is a child walking home from a school bus stop and sliding the key into the front door lock at around 3:15 p.m. Each day, the refrigerator typically contained snacks a parent had laid out in the morning before leaving for work, and the phone on the kitchen wall was the lifeline to the parent who might not return until 6:30 p.m. that evening, or even later if the commute was long, and the parent worked a non-standard shift in the same household in the same neighborhood. Children described the experience in research interviews with notable consistency across the studies. The house felt bigger when empty. The first 10 minutes after school arrival were the worst, with heightened awareness of sounds, and an unsettled feeling that faded as the routine became more familiar to the child over the same weeks and months. After a few weeks, the same children reported boredom rather than fear, with TV watching and snack making and homework doing as the dominant after-school activities. The weight was structural rather than traumatic in most documented cases, but it was not chosen by the child, and it was not always safe in the same home environment. The defining paradox of the cohort is the combination of high self-sufficiency and a low rate of help-seeking when something is wrong. And Gen X adults consistently display elevated self-sufficiency, lower rates of asking for managerial guidance, high tolerance for ambiguity, willingness to job hop repeatedly, comfort with self-directed learning on the job. At the same time, surveys and clinical literature document low rates of mental health treatment seeking among the same cohort, low rates of emotional disclosure among peers, and high rates of describing themselves as okay when they are clearly not okay, which is the wound that got called resilience across the same working life in the same era. Childhood psychology research during the same window produced important findings about what developmental psychologists call self-regulation and self-efficacy, the internal sense that one can manage one's own environment without adult help, a capability that latchkey kids developed in measurable quantities in the same cohort in the same era. Children who managed hours alone did, on average, develop higher self-efficacy scores on standardized measures, and they also, on average, displayed fewer help-seeking behaviors at school, fewer questions to teachers, less willingness to raise a hand for help even when stuck on a problem they did not understand in the same classroom. Some research has linked this same help-seeking pattern to reduced engagement with health care and psychological care systems 20 years later in adulthood, which is a slow-moving consequence of the same childhood pattern that was installed into the cohort by household circumstance, rather than by any intent on the parent's part. The phrase the brief uses is precise. A wound that got called resilience. The capacity to function alone is real across this cohort, but the inability to ask for help when needed is a separate acquisition, not a strength, and it was installed into a generation by circumstance, not by any intentional parenting choice in the same family at the same time. Academic literature on latchkey children accelerated in the mid-1980s after a national conversation about the topic peaked. Studies by Steinberg, Vandel, and others examined academic outcomes and found that parental presence after school was a strong predictor of academic engagement and reduced risk-taking behavior among children of the same age group. The mechanism was not supervision per se, but structured time and adult checkpoints during the afternoon which gave children a predictable rhythm and a clear sense of when an adult would next appear in the home, which in turn reduced their willingness to take risks during the unsupervised hours of the afternoon in the same neighborhood. Other research has found that extended latchkey hours correlated with higher rates of self-reported loneliness, mild hyperactivity indicators at school, and slightly elevated rates of experimentation with risk behavior, such as minor substance experimentation during the same age window in the same cohort, in the same era on the same surveys. Critically, latchkey status in the research literature is itself a marker rather than a diagnosis. Working mothers were the statistically dominant antecedent. But the causal story is not clean because the same households tend to have other overlapping stressors that also predict the same outcome in the same data set on the same children. Children from low-income families had higher latchkey rates. Children from single-parent families had higher latchkey rates. Children with longer parent commute times had higher latchkey rates, and after-school program availability cut latchkey rates by roughly half in the few districts that operated such programs at full scale in the same decade. The conclusion from the research is consistent. Latchkey status was a proxy for structural family stress and a lack of public investment in child care infrastructure, not a parenting choice that any single family made on its own, without reference to the same broader economic forces affecting millions of other families in the same country in the same decade. Gen X parenting today reflects the counterreaction to those childhood patterns and is observable in the same generation's teenage and young adult children. Gen X parents are statistically more likely than baby boomer parents to supervise structured after-school activities for their own children on the same weekday afternoons across the same communities. The same Gen X parents are more likely to enroll children in sports or arts programs, more likely to be physically present at home earlier in the evening, and more likely to volunteer at the school than boomer parents were at the same age on the same surveys taken across the same country in the same recent years on the same calendar. And yet a documented fraction of Gen X parents report exhaustion with the very level of presence they themselves did not have as children, with the pendulum swinging hard in the other direction in many households, and the same generation feeling caught between two competing styles of parenting on the same block, in the same neighborhood, in the same week. Many Gen X parents report the same difficulty with asking for help they experienced as children in the 1970s and 1980s, with the help-seeking reflex still not there in adulthood. The willingness to organize their children's lives is there, but the willingness to call a friend and say, "I cannot do this," for the Gen X demographic, is still constrained across the same households. U.S. maternal labor force participation rose from roughly 19% in 1960 to roughly 51% in 1985, for married women with children under 6, a doubling over just 25 years. That is the steepest sustained change in maternal employment patterns in the country's recorded history on the same calendar, in the same Bureau of Labor Statistics data. Divorce rates roughly doubled between 1965 and 1980 in the United States, peaking above 5 divorces per 1,000 population in 1981, and contributing to the rapid growth in single-parent households that drove much of the latchkey pattern in the same decade across the same country, in the same calendar, on the same national statistics from the same period. Single-parent households tripled as a share of all U.S. households with children between 1970 and the mid-1980, which is also the steepest sustained change in household structure in the country's recorded history, and is tightly correlated with the same growth in latchkey status that the same surveys picked up in the same era. The phrase latchkey kid entered popular U.S. usage in the late 1970s and surged in 1983 to 1984 in news coverage and academic debate, with the term adopted by journalists to describe the same pattern that researchers had been documenting with more granular quantitative methods in the same years, on the same calendar across the same country. Enrollment in licensed after-school programs has chronically fallen short of demand across the same decades, with waiting lists common at IMCA, schools, and municipal programs that operate at full capacity every weekday afternoon, and cannot accept any more children in the same neighborhoods in the same zip codes in the same decade. Generation X is approximately 65 million people in the United States today, which is larger than commonly remembered as a cohort and demographically significant. The same generation now occupies the most senior operational roles in U.S. institutions across both the public and private sectors on the same calendar in 2026. A peak estimate placed as many as 14.3 million children, roughly 25% of all K-12 students, spending portions of the afternoon without adult supervision in the mid-1980s. And that figure is consistent with the order of magnitude estimates from independent surveys taken in the same era across the same country in the same calendar. Generation X now occupies the most senior operational roles in U.S. institutions, corporate middle management, hospital administration, school principalships, bench-level judicial appointments, fire and police departments, and military field-grade ranks. And the shape of those institutions is therefore being shaped by adults who were trained in childhood to handle things themselves. The structural problem is not that they cannot perform in those roles. The structural problem is that the leaders they are producing and the institutions they run are slow to ask for help in crisis, slow to escalate problems up the chain, and prone to underreport problems until those problems are visible from the outside on the same dashboards. There is no upside to the inherited pattern that was not earned by the children who carried it across the same childhood afternoons. Most of the pattern is a scar rather than a strength, and most of the time the same scar is invisible to colleagues who only see the high-functioning adult rather than the child behind the same adult. The shared childhood experience has created a cohort-level pattern of independence that reads externally as competence, but internally as a difficulty with disclosure. And that same pattern is visible across the cohort in clinical settings, in workplaces, in marriages, and in the same patterns of help-seeking across the same generation on the same surveys. Clinical literature on the same cohort documents elevated rates of depression and anxiety diagnoses measured against prior generations on the same instruments. But the same cohort is also documented as having very low treatment-seeking rates, which means the same elevated prevalence is paired with the same low rate of getting any help for the same conditions. Workplace literature on the same cohort documents a tendency to over-prepare and over-deliver rather than ask clarifying questions of colleagues and supervisors, which reads externally as a strength, but internally is the same help-seeking refrain applied in a different context across the same generation on the same calendar in the same institutions. Parenting literature on the same cohort documents the counterreaction in the form of high involvement in children's after-school schedules that the same parents did not have access to as children, with the same pendulum swing visible across the same neighborhoods in the same school districts in the same surveys in the same decade. Demographers estimate that the same cohort will continue to occupy senior operational roles in U.S. institutions for at least the next 10 to 15 years, before retirement begins to thin their ranks across the same institutions, which means the same patterns will shape the same institutions for at least another decade across the same country in 2026. The conversation worth having is not whether the cohort is resilient. The cohort is resilient. But whether institutional culture should change to make help-seeking easier for the same cohort and for the generations that follow rather than continuing to treat the same pattern as a strength that masks the same underlying structural cost. The headline from the data is that an entire cohort of 65 million Americans was trained in childhood to handle things alone, that the training was installed by circumstance rather than by intent, and that the resulting cohort is now senior enough in U.S. institutions that the same pattern shapes the same institutions across the country in 2026. The same pattern is unlikely to change through individual willpower. It was installed by structural forces and only structural responses, like universal after-school programs and visible parental leave and stable single-parent support, will bend the same curve for the next cohort of children who will inherit the same structural conditions. If you take one number from this video, take 14.3 million children unsupervised on a typical 1984 weekday afternoon, and let that number stand for the order of magnitude scale of the same phenomenon across the same country, in the same decade, in the same cohort, that is now running the same institutions in the same country today in 2026. The same cohort is also about 65 million people in the United States today, which is larger than commonly remembered and is demographically significant. Gen X is not a small cohort, and the patterns discussed in this video are patterns of tens of millions of people, rather than patterns of a small specialist group on the same calendar across the same country. The phrase the brief returns to is the right one, a wound that got called resilience. And the message worth keeping from this video is that the same wound is now structural in U.S. institutions because the same cohort is now senior enough in those institutions to shape the same institutional culture for the next decade, in the same direction across the same country in 2026. The next video on this channel will dig into the institutional consequences of the same pattern in healthcare and K-12 schooling, where the same help-seeking reflex absence shows up most starkly on the same dashboards, and in the same patient and student outcomes across the same institutions on the same calendar across the same country this year.